Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich darf Sie recht herzlich begrüßen bei unserem Webinar, dem CSS Brownback Webinar, der sicherheitspolitische Lunch im Homeoffice, obgleich vielleicht der ein oder andere von Ihnen gar nicht mehr im Homeoffice ist, aber sei es drum. Wir freuen uns, dass Sie heute wieder bei uns sind. Wir wollen heute das letzte Kapitel unserer Jahrespublikation Strategic Trends 2020 vorstellen. Mein Name ist Oliver Trenert und ich bin der Leiter des Think Tanks am Center for Security Studies. Und das Thema lautet heute China als Stresstest für den europäischen Zusammenhalt. Wie wir gesehen haben in den letzten Wochen und Monaten, die Corona-Krise hat es deutlicher gemacht, als es ohnehin schon war. China stellt den Zusammenhalt Europas auf eine sehr harte Probe. Da sind einerseits diejenigen, die China zunehmend kritisch sehen, aufgrund seiner mehr und mehr verhärteten autoritären Strukturen intern, aber auch wegen seines zunehmend aggressiven Auftretens in der Region, also nach außen hin. Und vor allen Dingen auch die zumindest anfängliche Vertuschung des Corona-Ausbruchs in China hat sicherlich dazu beigetragen, dass kritische Reflexionen in Europa über China zugenommen haben. Auf der anderen Seite gibt es allerdings auch viele europäische Regierungen und Bevölkerungen, die China eher als Partner sehen, da China gerade auch jetzt in der Corona-Krise Hilfe angeboten hat bei der Bekämpfung des Virus, bei der Bekämpfung der Pandemie, die gerne angenommen wird. Und daher eben wird China weniger kritisch gesehen in manchen europäischen Ländern, als es beispielsweise in Frankreich oder in anderen führenden europäischen Ländern der Fall ist. Was also kann getan werden, damit Europa im Umgang mit China besser zusammengehalten werden kann? Darüber sprechen heute meine beiden Kolleginnen und Kollegen Linda Maduz und Henrik Larsen. Sie sind beide Senior Researcher bei uns im Think Tank. Linda im Team Globale Sicherheit und Henrik im Team Schweizerische und Euroatlantische Sicherheit. Ihre Präsentation wird auf Englisch erfolgen. Wir werden danach aber die Diskussion auf Deutsch und Englisch führen können. Beide verstehen gut Deutsch. Und Sie richten bitte wieder wie immer Ihre Fragen während des Vortrages oder auch danach im Chat-Modus an mich. So, und damit genug der Vorrede. Dann möchte ich Henrik das Wort erteilen, um mit der Präsentation zu beginnen. Henrik?
Thank you, Oliver, for this introduction. So let me get started immediately without further ado. So it's important to understand that China today has become a European power. It's a challenge that is more important than Russia when we speak European security. But what exactly is the nature of the Chinese challenge? Well, for all near future, China will not represent a military threat to Europe, but the real threat that China poses to Europe is the challenge of coherence between the European countries. That's why the presentation is called Stress Test. China is a stress test for European countries' capacity to act together on strategic issues. And that is so because China creates new geo-economic dependencies that weaken the integration between the European states and in turn puts the obstacle in the way for them to act together on strategic issues. So in our chapter to the strategic trends, the flagship publication of the CSS, our chief contribution has been to the policy debate has been to try to be as specific as possible about how exactly China impacts European security. How exactly should we understand China to be able to act against it? So our main contribution is we try to add some conceptual clarity by distinguishing 6 methods of Chinese power. Seeing together all of these 6 methods of Chinese power bind into a broader objective of divide and rule. Divide and rule is the overarching objective that China, the effect of Chinese power, but there are 6 sub-elements of that divide and rule. And on that basis, at the end of the presentation, we allow ourselves come up with some cautious assessment of viable policy responses, giving Chinese power what are the means by which we can respond to China. But let's first embark on each of these challenges one by one. And the first challenge we would like to bring to your attention is what we call innovate and rule. Innovation is a chief challenge posed by China to Europe and the West. China has the ambition to become a leader in the production of high-tech technology. today China's high-tech capacity is still a surprise to many, but in fact we should have known, we should have been aware about it already in 2015 when China published a strategic document, which now everyone is talking about. It's called Made in China 2025. 5 years ago, few people had the foresight to see what could be the implications of this document. But as we know today, everything is super clear about China's goals, especially when it comes to the rise of Huawei, the Chinese company within telecommunications technology. And that is so because Huawei offers the 5G network, the next generation of telecommunication networks, 5G, cheaper and faster than any other global competitor. And so why is that a problem? Well, that's a problem because China is able to set the technological standards, and thereby it will bring itself ahead of other competitors in the future. Other competitors, including Western companies, will have to adapt to the Chinese standards if China gets the upper hand now. And there is also an important value aspect here, apart from the pure industrial advantage, namely the values that Chinese standards do not hold safeguards against privacy intrusion and free speech repression, things that we value highly here in this part of the world. So there are two problems with that. Just to conclude on the innovation, it's still mostly today about telecommunications, but let's always look ahead when it comes to innovation. Tomorrow will be maybe about something else like robotics, shipbuilding, and the latest thing is facial recognition technology that probably will arise as the next challenge. So, and the second challenge that we have distinguished is what we call cheat and rule, which is actually, sorry, I forgot to put the slide ahead here. So that's the second challenge, cheat and rule, which also somehow relates to innovation, which is more an old than a new challenge actually. The fact that China brings itself ahead technologically by imposing unfair market conditions on others. And we see that in the fact that China subsidizes its national companies heavily. It ignores intellectual property rights, meaning Chinese companies are allowed unsanctioned to steal business secrets and intellectual secrets from competing companies in the West and Europe. It's also seen the fact that China puts obstacles in the way for Western companies that want to do business in China. So, for instance, forced transfer of technology. If companies want to operate in China, they are obliged to transfer the technology and know-how that they have. Another element is regulatory regimes that overly favor Chinese companies in China. So you can say, in conclusion, it's simply not compatible with the international free trade regime to have a major mercantilist power within it. And then Linda will...
Thanks. So buy and rule. This is the third method of Chinese power in Europe, which we examined in our book chapter. The activities we analyzed under this method are strategic Chinese investments in Europe. So investments by Chinese state-owned, state-backed companies. They are probably the clearest manifestation of how China has been increasing its influence, its presence in Europe. And a manifestation of how China has created dependencies that have created, again, in turn, a divisive effect on European coherence. So Europe today is an important strategic priority in China's expansive investment policy framework. The bulk of China's FDI has been flowing to Western Europe, the UK, Germany, Italy, and France. In these countries, Chinese investors have targeted high-tech sectors and research and development networks, amongst others. Chinese FDI follows a bit of a different pattern in other European sub-regions. In Southern Europe, for example, it was the restructuring after the financial and the debt crisis and the privatization processes that followed that opened new doors for Chinese companies. In Portugal, for example, Chinese companies acquired significant interest in the energy sector and in the finance sector starting in 2010. So these are all critical infrastructure, energy sector, high-tech sectors. Now, in Central and Eastern Europe, the focus of Chinese engagement follows again a bit of a different logic. China here is financing large construction projects such as bridges, motorways, and high-speed rail lines. These latter projects and also investments in port infrastructure in the Mediterranean, for example, these are all projects where we see that Chinese investors are not necessarily following a strict market logic. So these are projects that are not necessarily seen as economically and financially viable by other investors. So this suggests that there are some geopolitical interests behind such investments. So through these investment activities and these infrastructure projects, China has been expanding its presence in Europe and has been creating dependencies which vary across countries, which vary across sub-regions. Now, a fourth method of Chinese power we look at in our chapter is closely related to this buy and rule method. We call it befriend and rule. In addition to intensifying its economic relations with European countries, China has been very actively promoting political cooperation. Such political initiatives are designed to complement and to facilitate investments and trade flows. We see that with the 17+1 initiative. This is a regional cooperation format which China launched in its original format back in 2012. It is a cooperation between China and Central and Eastern European countries. What is typical of these political initiatives is that they are tailored to specific regions and to specific countries. Today, most European countries have some sort of strategic partnership agreement with China in place. So China is promoting its own cooperation format, is establishing direct links with countries and also with actors at the subnational level. As a result, China often bypasses and thereby weakens established mechanisms and institutions and processes that exist at higher political levels, such as the level of the European Union. So we can argue that through its economic and political advances, China has managed to institutionalize a pro-Chinese group of states in the periphery of Europe. And as a result, it is becoming more and more difficult to come up with common EU positions and policy decisions vis-à-vis China. We have seen that when the EU wanted to jointly criticize China on human rights concerns or wanted to come up with a coordination mechanism in the area of investment controls. Here, countries like Greece and Portugal who have benefited strongly from Chinese investments have been more cautious and not willing to join EU statements.
Yeah, but actually the China is going further than just befriending. There is also a fifth element, which is we would call here infiltrate and rule. So it's already known that China has paid politicians and academics in other countries to promote China-friendly narratives. We've seen that in the Czech Republic and also in one case in Germany. But this methods, this infiltration is become maybe more accentuated today after the Corona crisis. The Corona crisis has underlined what means China is willing to pursue, to assert itself, notably, as we saw during the Corona crisis, diplomatic pressure to promote China-friendly narratives and suppress China skeptic narratives. We've seen that in Australia, where China threatened to impose sanctions for the inquiry into the spread of the pandemic. At the EU level, pressure to change the report, an internal report in the EU Foreign Service about the language on China and the role that China played in disinformation. And not least, the role that China played within the WHO, the World Health Organization. Director General Dr. Tedros showing more than willing to praise China, despite, I think we can say that at least China in the beginning of the pandemic did not show transparency. So diplomatic pressure is one. The other element is disinformation campaigns to promote China-friendly narratives. These are more subtle, and there is not necessarily a China mark on them, but they are there, something that the international organizations have acted on. So the Corona crisis, I think, underlines more than ever it's become clear to everyone more than before that we're dealing with a confrontation between values. I mean, all countries want to promote a positive image of themselves, you can say. But what is different in China is that it seeks to attack and try to eliminate negative narratives by means of more active measures, including infiltration and diplomatic measures.
And there is a sixth method of power, which we address in our book chapter. We call it protect and rule. So we said at the beginning of the presentation that China is not posing a military threat to Europe. However, there are some security aspects to China's growing presence in Europe, which is worth mentioning. I would like to cite the example of Serbia. Serbia is the biggest country in the Western Balkans, and Serbia has participated in several security-related arrangements. This includes joint police patrols in Serbian cities and also joint anti-terror drills. Serbia is also engaged in arms procurement deals with China and has welcomed the Huawei pilot project Safe City solution, which employs facial recognition technology. So this is a local and limited phenomenon, but it is just another layer of Chinese influence in a region which is becoming more and more dependent on China. So this is an additional way to, or it shows like how China ties in countries into its orbit. So by labeling and mapping these various methods of Chinese power in Europe, we can show that China's presence in Europe is growing. And we can show that China is more active in some regions, especially in the European periphery, than in others. At least with certain methods of power, it's more active in certain regions. And this map illustrates this. More specifically, the map shows the buy and rule and the befriend and rule dimensions. And we can come back to it in the discussion if this is of interest. But I would like to move on to the policy options, which we describe in the second part of our chapter. So in a first step, what we have been trying to do is to identify and label these various China-led activities which are relevant from a European strategic perspective. Now in the second step, what we would like to do is to describe the political reactions that we see emerging in response to these methods of Chinese power. And we started discussion about policy options that European countries have started to pursue or could and should pursue. So on the left-hand side, you see these various aspects of power once more. And on the right-hand side, you see policy answers, which we have been trying to identify by challenge. So our approach was to first identify the challenges, because we think it's necessary to be then able to come up with adequate policy answers. As a general remark, we can say that European response to China has been piecemeal and that it has been slow. But we see clear strategic shifts, and such a strategic shift has been taking place last year, in 2019, at the level of the European Union. We see that in statements, we see that in strategy papers. And similar strategic shifts we also see in larger European countries such as Germany and France. We see them less in smaller countries in the European periphery.
So the first policy response we have listed here relates most closely to the innovate and rule element of the challenge. And the fact that European industries in the long run, they cannot compete against China if they are not protected from the unfair competition that China imposes on them. So there are legitimate ways by which you can support European companies that even are far from the heavy subsidies that China gives to their national companies. For instance, giving financial loans to companies that they will have to pay back only as they sell their products, or support with infrastructure. It's a major element when you create an industrial center, is that there is state support for the infrastructure around. We believe here the best example that Europe should look to is the European aerospace industry, namely Airbus based in Toulouse, which was exactly this model. So infrastructure and loans that have to be paid back as you sell products. That could be a model for how to support the existing industries in Europe. Telecommunication industry, we have two major companies, Ericsson in Sweden and Nokia in Finland, but there might be other industries that would need similar support to stand up to the Chinese challenge in the future. The big question, however, is the EU ready to abandon the internal competition for the sake of strengthening its external competition on the global market? Because this goes against what the EU originally was put in place for. There has been discussions maybe for 10 years about external competition, but I think only now it's really getting serious, some pertinence about it. But it's a debate that is just starting to take off. The second element relates to imposing costs for breaches, so that and that relates to the cheat and rule. China's mercantilist behaviors inherit to the control of the Communist Party. China will not change its course unless it has clear incentive to do so, so either domestic benefits or a damage to its external sanctions. The good news is that the Chinese industry still depends hugely on the access to the Western market, and China's growth at large still is hugely export dependent. So that might be a leverage strong enough to push for some change. The third element is investment screenings, which relates both to cheat and rule and buy and rule. Making sure that investments that China is allowed to undertake in Europe do not question the security of critical infrastructure. This is what we are talking about. Investment screenings must be in place for this specific reason. So enforcement of investment screenings is mostly a national competency. The EU last year put in place a framework for incoming foreign direct investments by which it can warn about investment that might put in question critical infrastructure. So that's a start. But the EU has some powers within its exclusive trade competency to screen investments and block investment, notably when it comes to public tenders. There has been at least one occasion where a Chinese company has been willing to bribe itself through the tenders. That is, of course, clearly in violation of European law. The EU is currently discussing steps against subsidized companies that operate in Europe, another important step.
So what Henrik has been describing are the more technical responses to the challenges that China poses. However, there are also some more political initiatives that are worth mentioning. These political initiatives show a change in the political mindset in Brussels and the new political will to find common responses to China. So one initiative that is interesting is the EU's reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has an important geopolitical dimension. The EU launched its own connectivity strategy back in 2018, and it appointed an ambassador at large for connectivity in 2019. So the goal here is to promote an own way of connectivity, the European way of connectivity, which should, among other things, be more sustainable. Also in response to Chinese initiatives, the EU wants to strengthen its own efforts in infrastructure financing. The EU has recognized that infrastructure investment needs are high and that they are increasing in some European countries. So the EU wants to leverage its own strength and the strength of existing multilateral financial institutions to fund and manage infrastructure projects. And a last initiative I want to mention, which is maybe the beginning of a new strategy, is that the EU wants to cooperate more systematically with like-minded countries. And Japan is an example of an important partner in this. The EU has recently signed a trade agreement. It has signed a strategic partnership agreement with Japan. So the idea is to partner up with Japan to balance Chinese influence in Europe's neighborhoods and other world regions. Both are important donors of development aid and they want to join forces there. But Japan is also an important partner to protect and promote shared values and norms such as democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So, and Japan is lastly also an important partner when it comes to shaping standards, industrial standards, technology standards. And I will continue with the last point on our slide, which is counter disinformation. It is during the current COVID crisis, it has become very evident to many people that China seeks to shape public opinion about China in other countries. So as a reaction to these recent influence efforts, the European Commission accused China of running disinformation campaigns inside the EU. And for the first time, the Commission named not only Russia, but also China as a source of disinformation. This is new.
All right, before we go to Q&A, maybe just some final concluding remarks about the Corona crisis. I think we cannot escape mentioning that the crisis has led to a new awareness about what the rise of China carries with it. So if there is one good thing about the Corona crisis, is that it came now and not in 5 years. We should pay attention to China's behavior, especially in the soft diplomacy going forward, the soft diplomacy on the United Nations, which is also interesting from a Swiss perspective, because it's based in Geneva, most of this soft diplomacy, where China is asserting itself. It's becoming a new conflict zone over values and how international governance should take place. It seems, however, China is aware that it may have overstepped a little bit here during this crisis. There is a leaked report to China's top political leadership in April, concluding that the global anti-China sentiment is at its highest since the Tiananmen's protest in 1989. And that's quite interesting, I think. There has been a general awakening about China. Core Europe definitely has woken up. It's still uncertain whether Eastern and Southern Europe are changing their perceptions about China. It remains to be seen.